everybody, and thank you for coming. Yes, okay, thank you. Right. Thank you very much for coming to our knowledge share, Beyond Z or Z, Understanding the UK's Young People. So this knowledge share has been generously sponsored by Yasna.ai, the AI-powered platform that helps independent researchers, consultants, and research agencies scale in-depth interviews. Claim your free 14 days Yasna Pro free trial today. Conduct up to 50 interviews worth €100. And to do this, sign up at yasna.ai. And I'd like to thank very much Konrad for doing this for us. Konrad specialises in working with clients in media, entertainment and technology, providing them with cultural and behavioural insights to navigate digital transformation, develop content and marketing strategies, and inform wider business strategy. Much of his work focuses on the changes being wrought by young people coming of age in a very different landscape to that which shaped older generations. Okay, over to you, Konrad.
Great, thank you. Sorry, just bear with me a second. Lovely. Well, yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. I can't see anybody anymore, so if I'm talking into the void, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to start. I'm Konrad. And I'm here to present Beyond Z. It definitely is a Z. It's the UK's young people, not anyone else's. So it's not a Z in our world. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of an introduction into why hopefully you feel that you should listen to me. Not that I am the oracle and not that Craft has done can answer every single question that is about young people, but we've got a long history in working with amongst young people, but not only young people, very importantly. We're not a youth agency, and we don't only work amongst people under the age of 30, for example. And that's very, very important, as we'll come on to discuss later. As Lynn mentioned, we tend to work in media and technology and in the entertainment sectors, but the questions that we get asked are very, very wide-ranging. What's the role of religion in the UK today? What's it really like to be young? Why do people trust or mistrust advertising? So a lot of the work that we do, although it has a practical end, starts quite often by really broad contextual pieces that aim to understand what's going on in the world more broadly. And we work with some pretty big clients to help them with that. Because I work in media, entertainment, and technology, the clients in those industries especially are obsessed with young people. Partly it's because those industries are obsessed with young people and are very youthful industries, but also partly it's because that phrase that Lynn used, digital transformation, is a massive thing, whether it's for legacy media brands like ITV or The Guardian or BBC who are trying to make sense and adapt to this new world from an old media perspective, whether it's for more new media brands like Red Bull, like Netflix or Red Bull coming in as more digitally native brands, or whether it's regulators like Ofcom having to deal with all the change that's happening. You may have seen some of the work that we've done, especially for Channel 4, and that's as well as all the projects that we've done over the past 15, 20 years. What I'm going to take you through here is a trilogy of projects that started back in 2021, actually, but was published in 2022, Beyond Z. We've updated that recently in 2024 with Gen Z, Trends, Truth and Trust. You may have seen it on the front of the Times, what we refer to as Dictatorgate. To be clear, we have never said that Gen Z are in favour of dictatorship. It's a classic example of an overzealous PR and a journalist looking for headlines, totally misinterpreting and misrepresenting data. But we've got a really large body of work to show you here today. Let's start. I mean, the first thing to say is there is no shortage of megabytes, pixels, column inches dedicated to talking about young people. And very often they're not listened to. They're not part of these conversations, which we feel isn't a great place to start. Um, if my clients were here, they would start this presentation by saying the reason that they commissioned these series of projects that we did for Channel 4 was because they were getting increasingly frustrated by the amount of contradictory and reductive and sort of intuitively nonsensical research, in air quotes, that was crossing their desks. And here we got some choice headlines about Gen Z being lazy yet coming here to save the world with their wokeness while blaming older generations. These things cannot stand up. They cannot live in consistently and coherently next to each other. And actually, we've seen this a lot with our work as well, that our work has been used to support preconceived positions. So if we put out a press release or we put out exactly the same data, the Daily Mail, the Guardian, and the Times will use exactly the same findings to support what you would expect to be their positions, which has been a very interesting journey in the uses of research out there in the wider world. Okay. But why, if we look at all these narratives, we see that young people are often portrayed pretty reductively as either saviors, devils, or victims, and the stories are pretty reductive, right? They're either Pollyanna Rosie or Cassandra Bleak, and this is a story as old as time itself. Well, maybe not that old, or maybe it is that old, but it definitely goes back to the beginnings of history. Here's Socrates. Supposedly he said this. I think that the likelihood is he didn't, but anyway, it makes for a good slide, and it makes the point. If we go back to these magazine covers, you'll see that every generation since the boomers has been labeled the me generation. Millennial, it sort of peaked at around millennials, where they were the me generation. We've had a me decade, and it just seems to be that we are addicted to this way of looking at the world, right? And I think that there are very good reasons for that. Partly it's because older people are to some degree suspicious, if not frightened, of change and things that they don't understand. And that's if you want a negative framing. I think a more positive framing that lives alongside it is that we worry about our children. And the world is getting more and more, well, it's changing faster and faster. So, 200 years ago, a parent would have had very similar experiences throughout their life stage as a child. That is just simply not the case anymore. And those of us who are parents of young children will know that, let alone teenagers. But the fact is, there is no they. As part of my presentation here, I looked at which countries have got a population similar to the size of the Gen Z population in the UK. It would make no sense to talk about all of Togo or all of Switzerland in one fell swoop. Yet we very easily and naturally, almost instinctively, tend to do so when it comes to young people. And one of the first phrases and the key takeouts that I'd like you to leave today's presentation with is there is no they. Right? It is hugely problematic to talk about them or Gen Z as one. Sometimes, very rarely, it's a useful shorthand. On occasion, speaking about them is meaningful, but ultimately, we need to use our critical faculties. And in these purple boxes on the right-hand side of this slide, I've got things that people just roll their eyes at when I present them to it, or they nod sagely, but they're like, this is obvious. And one of the things that we say is that lots of this stuff is obvious, but we need to remind our clients and people who we present this to of this stuff all the time, because if we don't remind them, they go back to that they, Gen Z versus Gen X, or whatever framings that come so naturally to us. So, I mean, in these purple boxes, we've got some pretty basic statements. In general, people don't radically or drastically change, at least not quickly. And when they do change, they change in largely predictable ways based on their life stage. Right. So young people aren't always that different from what came before them. And that's because being young isn't that different. It's still a time of identity formation. It's still a time of experimentation. It's still a time of aiming to fly the nest. All these things remain true. As true as they have been, at least since the invention of the teenager, and definitely for the past 70 years at least. Um, it's also obvious that they're not going to stay the same. So looking for these inherent characteristics that they will carry through them, carry with them through life, is pretty much a fool's errand most of the time. Uh, Equally, we look, this generational framing really tends to prioritize someone's date of birth, right? But obviously, that's only one element of their identity. Intersectionality is key. Individuality is also key, more so now, probably more so than ever. And inequality is also within the cohort is also a massive thing. And so if we're going to rely on someone's date of birth as the primary element of their identity, we might as well stop researching and start using horoscopes. Another thing that we see that is done all the time is this confection of findings from Germany and the US and the UK. We say, oh, and we give ourselves the easy out that the internet has made this a global generation. So what applies in the US definitely applies in Stockton-on-Tees as well as in Frankfurt, and it's just simply not true. There are certain things that are potentially globally applicable, but they're very, very few and far between. Geography matters hugely. Young people tend to live very local existences and their worlds tend to be pretty small, at least at the beginning of the age cohort that we're talking about, which is around 13 to 27. Right. If you look back on and think about what life was like for you when you were 13, you probably didn't leave very far, at least far from home. Maybe to go to school or college, or maybe out to the local mall or local park, sometimes with your parents, maybe sometimes you're starting to get your independence. But the idea of the big wide world was sort of totally alien, really. Now, yes, the internet has brought the world into our screens and into our living rooms in a way that wasn't the case for older generations, but still, life tends to be very, very local. So if we want to boil all those boxes down into something that we can start to use, it's this idea of synthetic cohort analysis that says ultimately we're all the products of these three interrelated factors. They're all to do with time. Some people's behaviors, well, all our behaviors and attitudes change as we grow older or go through different life stages, whether that be moving out, having children, getting old, getting a mortgage, whatever it might be. And those things are kind of predictable, and we can at least look at how they are changing as well. For example, there is a new life stage of delayed adulthood because people are moving out later, but we at least understand that this is still a life stage effect. There are period effects, things that affect all of us. They might affect us in different ways, but I mean, great examples are the COVID pandemic, the advent of the internet, the increased securitization of society after 9/11, the financial crash in 2008. Right, so these are macro trends in society and culture that impact all of us. And then there are cohort and generational effects, and these are where behaviors and attitudes are set by the formative experiences of a generation. Now, the problem with synthetic cohort analysis, well, it's not a problem, it's just a limitation, I suppose, is that it's impossible to unpick these three things from each other with any great certainty. And the thing that those who are obsessed with generational thinking are really looking for and after is to isolate what the cohort and generational effects are. The fact is, we won't know until this generation grows up, right? Because we won't know whether what we are seeing as differences are something inherent that will stay with them throughout their lives, or whether they will change over the course of their lives and therefore be a life stage effect, right? So looking for these differences is very tricky and can be problematic. So theory aside, we started our journey into understanding Gen Z by doing something really, really simple. I mentioned that our clients were frustrated at some of the stuff that they were hearing because it just didn't feel right or it felt that it was contradictory. So we started off with a big literature review. And what we did is that we sort of coded essentially through a discourse analysis. The most, sorry, was someone saying something? Um, yeah, sorry. Yeah, we coded through a discourse analysis into 8 narratives, and we tried to approach these, well, as all good researchers should, with a totally open mind, right? We didn't want to say that these are true, these are untrue. These became our working hypotheses, right? And the eight most common narratives that we found, at least in our literature review, were these: that this is a particularly engaged politically generation, that they're all liberal, they're all woke, right? And this is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your position. But that is the case nonetheless. They're unhappy with the state of the world and they blame older generations for it. And in fact, they're largely in conflict with older generations. The main dynamic between the generations is one of conflict. They're a digital generation, right, living in the metaverse, into cryptocurrencies and NFTs. They're particularly entrepreneurial and all have side hustles. Social media is a pernicious influence in their lives, and more broadly, they spend too much time in front of screens. They're in particularly poor mental health, and brackets, social media is to blame solely for that. And the one that was obviously interesting to our client was that they don't watch TV, and that traditional broadcaster brands are irrelevant to them. That's less interesting for us here today, but that was obviously of interest to the client. So let's have a look at them. Right. So after about 6 months of research and dozens of digital ethnographies, I think 6,000 people surveyed, dozens of qualitative interviews, we felt that we were in a position to start to look at to answer some of these hypotheses. And it turned out that many are either myths or only partial truths. And I think that was one of the key lessons for the client from the work that we did, is that the world is just a much more nuanced place. And just because we're talking about a group of people who were born within 15 years of each other, it doesn't stop being a complex, nuanced place. Right. So there are some that we can categorically refute. They are no more politically engaged. In fact, they are less politically engaged than older generations are. That's not a surprise. Young people are always the least politically engaged group in society. However, they are more politically engaged than older generations were at the same age, but that is a period effect, right? It's not inherent to them. We are living through incredibly politicized times, and all generations are showing higher levels of politicization. That said, many young people are either ambivalent or apathetic. Some are illiberal. They're not necessarily all woke on social justice. Others are progressive in that they endorse the sort of broad causes of social justice, but are very unwilling to listen to any other points of view. And very few are activists. And this is again where kind of media narratives about Greta Thunberg and Malala tend to set unrealistic expectations for young people who are probably just trying to pass their exams or get a first job or whatever it is, find a boyfriend or a girlfriend, that kind of stuff. So, are they unhappy with the state of the world? Well, it depends what you ask people. If you ask, and this is true of anyone, and it's also true of young people themselves. If you ask them, are you optimistic about your future? They will say yes, broadly. Although there are differences by income, especially. And if you say, are you interested about are you optimistic about the future? They will say no, right? Because and then what this comes down to is feelings of control, right? But they don't particularly blame older generations. They sort of say, like, look, this is the issues that we see are societal issues, and everyone's got to take responsibility for them. And they're not in conflict with older generations broadly. From the ethnographies, but also from lots of quantitative work, what we see is that intergenerational relationships are largely characterized by love and respect. And one of the very simple questions that we ask people is, who do you look up to? And overwhelmingly, the answers came back: my grandparents, my parents, my teachers, my lecturers, my coaches, you know. And that's also an interesting thing about role models, that role models are found very close to home. Usually, we tend to sort of think of them as mediated, people, Marcus Rashford or, God forbid, Andrew Tate. But actually, the most powerful role models are modeled close to home. Are they a digital generation? Yes, well, of course they're digitally native, but actually they've been taught very strongly to value in real life IRL experiences and relationships, and actually they're very adept at seamlessly combining IRL and URL. And again, if you look into the research here, you say, oh, well, but I know people who are on their screens all the time, and say, yeah, there's a difference between problematic use of screens and volume. And also, there are small groups of young people who account for a lot of problematic use and a lot of the volume of use. Really, when we're talking about the majority of young people, they are very adept at balancing in real life experiences and digital experiences. They all have a side hustle, very common narrative. False. Ultimately, very few do. Those that do are usually spinning plates. It's not a sense of greater entrepreneurship usually that drives them, but actually a sense of economic precariousness. And we've characterized this as not side hustles, but side struggles, having to hold down multiple jobs, having to monetize wherever you can. But those who don't have to, don't do that. And in the end, most of them are focused on really boring, traditional pathways through life that require education and getting a good job. Right. It's not an ambition for most of them to be influenced, or even many of them to be influencers or to be side hustlers or entrepreneurs or run their own business. Social media is a pernicious influence in their lives, and in fact, they spend too much time online and in front of screens. Well, this is a very, very complex territory. And this is not to say that there are not clear downsides, some of which are very serious, and some of which some young people pay the ultimate price for. On balance, they feel that social media is more of a positive than a negative, while recognizing the very negative impacts. But what we found when we were looking through the discourse was that the positive impacts were almost absent from that, unless you started to get into the academic discourse. To give you some examples of the positive, we met a young LGBT woman from a very small village who was able to come out online and participate in the LGBT community online in a way that she would never have had the opportunity to in real life, simply because there were no other LGBT people where she lived, and this allowed her to help gain confidence and form identity, and ultimately meet a partner who she now lives with in a very loving relationship. So while there are problems with social media, and there are all manner of moral panics around them, we need to balance that with the good sides as well. I'm sure many of you have read The Anxious Generation, the book by Jonathan Haidt, very good book. But I think this is one of those where our worry for our children leads us to be blind to the facts, because even the interpretation of Jonathan Haidt's book has tended to be focus on half of his argument. Essentially, his argument is we have underprotected our children online while overprotecting them offline. That second bit tends to be forgotten, and the discourse goes to rushing towards smartphone bans, which have sort of been shown to be a bit unworkable, really. Which is not to say that the social platforms shouldn't stand up and protect young people from harm, but this is very, very complex territory that generally isn't reflected in the wider discourse. They're in particularly poor mental health. That was the one that we could prove without any shadow of a doubt, based on the literature review and based on talking to young people. But actually, social media was only the fifth biggest cause of this from our research, and cost of living, worries about the housing market, inability to find a job, and finding a partner were all higher, claimed at least, as causes for declining mental health. Although there are some positive signs that it might be rebounding. And one thing we should understand is that young people are still overwhelmingly happy, although their levels of happiness are declining year on year. Still, 71% say they are happy and 12% say they are unhappy. I'm going to skip over the traditional TV brands. It's a very niche point for our client. So what can we take from that? Many of the common narratives about young people are at best only partially true. Some are false. Commonalities within the age cohort are overstated. There is no such thing as a universal youth culture in the UK. There is no they. The differences between the generations are often false or overstated. Actually, one of the really heartening things that we found was that, and one of the worrying things is that these differences are heightened and highlighted because increasingly the generations don't mix. And that's true online, but also actually physically, in that the urban population is overwhelmingly young and the rural population is overwhelmingly old. But even in these mixed, even in places where the populations are largely mixed, the actual segregation of spaces is increasing, and that's something that I think as a society we need to watch out for. There are some generational effects. For example, the emergence of delayed adulthood, which is the biggest one that we can see. The fact that young people are staying at home longer, all the traditional markers of coming of age and growing up, becoming an adult, are happening much later. And that's got, again, like most things in our presentation, it's a double-edged sword. It's got positives in the sense that there's more time for experimentation and identity formation and less responsibility, especially for young women. This is one of the kind of dividends of women's liberation and feminism. But on the other hand, decreasing feelings of independence, potentially leading to increased issues with mental health, simply because young people are less able to. It's not that they're less willing to, it's that they're less able to stand on their own 2 feet. So that was the first project a couple of years ago. Then we explored the motivations for and value. This has got very media, very specific about how and why do young people watch different video to older people. And this chart shows you in quite stark relief how little in comparison TV and streaming, Netflix, Channel 4, BBC iPlayer, Channel 4 streaming service, that kind of stuff. How little of that they watch compared to all adults. And consequently, how much more social video they watch and how much more YouTube video they watch. Although what you can see is still over a third of their viewing is TV and streaming. So it's not that they don't watch TV, it's that their proportions are different. And Channel 4, as a broadcaster, wanted to know, like, what does this mean for us ultimately? Now we could go into that for a long time, but I don't think it's the thing that you guys are most interested in. But the one thing that we can take out is that the main thing, right, is that young people's and old people's cultural compasses are calibrated differently. It's quite often framed that young people are just looking for very different things. For different needs to be met from the video content that they watch. That's not true. We can prove that. We worked with behavioral psychologists, media psychologists, various experts to develop two psychological frameworks that we done a lot of work using observational data to code all viewing across young people and old people. And the fact is that we all have the same needs from the video content that we watch. The difference is that we meet them very differently. Um, and what that means again is that young people are looking not necessarily for different for the video to do different things in their lives, but the styles and the tones and the formats and the presenters and the talent that they like are very, very different. And therefore that impacts what they want from video and the video that they value. And what we're seeing is young people starting to grow up in a world where TV and the codes of TV production and the codes of TV presentation are not necessarily their default option, and they're not the yardstick by which they measure other video. Okay, so sometimes when they come to TV, they can look down on it because it isn't edgy enough, or it isn't it's too polished. The production values are too high, and therefore they feel it's inauthentic. That kind of stuff. But that was that project. Then we spent the whole of last year delving even deeper into Beyond Z and delivering this study, right? Again, so very similar questions, but one of the things that, we sort of in a way Beyond Z came back with an unsatisfactory answer, which was, well, they're not all the same. Okay, well, that's okay, great. Can you tell me how they're different from each other and what's changed in the past 2 years? So off we went and we did the same thing. Well, we did a very, very similar study again. And we looked at this in two ways. What are the things that are affecting all young people and conditioning the world that they grow up into? And then how are they different from each other? We came up with these 8 macro trends. Now, each of these I can and do sometimes give a presentation for an hour on. So I'm going to skip through them very quickly. Happiness used to be U-shaped. What we mean by that is you start off happy as a child. As you start to come of age, you get a little bit unhappier. You hit middle age, you're really unhappy. It's the unhappiest time in people's lives. And then happiness rebounds, usually after retirement, although never to the same levels as when we are children. That model is breaking down in the UK, as well as in some other Western countries. The model is becoming flat, not U-shaped, and in some places, including the UK, there are signs that for the first time, young people are unhappier than older people, which should worry us all because that U-shaped model is breaking down. It's sort of not the way things are supposed to be. We're seeing some evidence that the genders on average are pulling apart. So previously, education or income was the biggest factor in pulling people's political values apart. We're starting to see that be replaced since about 2010 by gender. Does not mean that all boys are right wing and all girls are left wing by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that we're seeing a change in the pattern again. We're seeing one very specific group of white working class boys be left behind. We called them the Lost Boys due to the collapse in the manufacturing base, multi-generational unemployment, and potentially other issues as well around identity. And this is ending up in some not very nice places. And clearly, adolescence talks about this. But also we need to think not only about their impact on women and they're by no means, again, all misogynist, but actually the fact that we are leaving a group of people in our society behind. Other interesting things that came out of this study, a very flat pattern of trust in traditional institutions and media. Like essentially, they're very, very confused around what the truth is, what objectivity is, who they can trust. Growing up in a world of misinformation and disinformation, it's amazing that you can talk to a young person who, sort of 15 years old, and they'll talk to you about confirmation bias. which was something that I hadn't come across until I was probably about 30 years old. But they talk, as well as talking the language of mental health, they can talk the language of these sorts of biases, and it leads to a very confused picture for them, because they're growing up in a confusing time as a period effect. But obviously, it's a confusing time of life as they're still forming their identity, and so you might think that we've got it bad when we don't understand what's going on with pronouns, and we sort of assume that young people, they're all across this and they get it intuitively. But I've sat there talking to 16-year-olds who are like, oh, I don't even know which toilet I should go into, and isn't this mad? Um, so it's difficult for them. Uh, there's a very interesting trend around an increasing zero-sum thinking. This idea that for one group to win, so for one group to succeed in society, another has to lose. And that is a particular generational trait. It's much, much higher amongst young people than it is amongst older people. Um, with potentially worrying consequences. But part of the reason that we've identified for that is that this is a highly individualistic culture, as far as there is one youth culture. And that is no surprise. These are Thatcher's grandchildren. They've grown up in a world that it's not all about social media and influencers and me. They've grown up in a world where there's been no real meaningful debate about the individual being the primary, sort of unit that we should focus on in society. There's not been really any meaningful debate for 30 years in politics about that. It's just taken as a given. Honourable mention to Jeremy Corbyn aside, not this is not a party political broadcast by any stretch of the imagination, but that's the only alternative conversation there's been. And he was pretty well supported by young people, at least initially. And so you end up with this world that's actually quite tricky for them, in that they're coming of age in a world where the traditional models of social mobility, you get in what you get out what you put in, that sort of basic capitalist social contract has broken down for young people, and they end up not trusting very many people at all, apart from each other and themselves, to make their way in life. So it feels pretty bleak, if I'm honest, in terms of the world that has been built for them to come of age into. And it's worth us remembering that when we start to judge them and think about them and cast aspersions on them, because they're growing up into a world that was created for them. And actually, through meeting them, loads of them, there's great variation, but they're approaching the world with what you'd expect from young people, which is optimism, creativity, vim, vigor, and despite a lot of these difficulties. So those are the conditions that they're growing up into. But ultimately, how are they different, right? That was the exam question that we were set. And the first thing to say is that we didn't assume that worldview or mindset, which ended up being important, was important. We did a pretty sophisticated, again, quantitative analysis informed by some pretty high-powered desk research, and we looked at all people in the UK, 13 to 65, through three lenses. We looked at them through the lens of identity and the things that people say were important identity markers to them: their gender, their hobbies, their interests, their ethnicity, their region, all these kinds of things. And identity wasn't actually as important as you might think. It was very important for certain identity groups, right? So LGBT people, neurodiverse people, these sort of small marginalized minority communities felt that their identity markers were very important to them, understandably. It, Interestingly, ethnic minorities were not actually did not actually feel it was as important to them in terms of forming their identity as other factors. But what you ended up with was a big mass of people who were exactly the same in the sense that they didn't feel that their identity made much difference at all. So this was only partially useful. We looked at specifically what people do, their hobbies, their interests, what they do, the sort of tribes or cultures that they belong to. And that wasn't useful at all because there was so much overlap. We've all got so many leisure options. I can be a football fan one day, a bicycle fan another day, a craft beer fan another day. So that might be important to us as individuals, but it doesn't help us understand how people are different to each other. And what was important was how people think and feel about the world, right? That was the thing that really split people apart. The data, the clusters jumped out of the data. So let's meet them. It's important to say, like any segmentation, it's a mix of art and science. This was mainly meant to be a segmentation of young people. So if we were trying to create a segmentation of older people, there would be more groups in the 28 to 65 group. But given the purposes that we were, the objectives of the project, we put those to one side and we focused on the 6 Gen Z worldviews. Now, again, as you'd expect, some groups cross generations. So 2 of our segments, the Boys Can't Be Boys and the Fight for Rights, they were they were present amongst older people as well as amongst younger people. But these four segments on the right, Girl Power, the Dice Are Loaded, the Zero Sum Thinkers, and the Blank Slates, they were almost exclusively found in the Gen Z cohort. Some of them had analogues in the older cohort as well, but were slightly different in their articulation. So let's have a look at some of them. Boys can't be boys. Importantly, these are not all male. 1 in 5 are female. And these are people who essentially feel that masculinity is under attack, and more broadly that traditional values are being eroded. So this kind of masculinity idea is actually nests within this wider idea that something is changing, and they're not comfortable with it and they're not happy with it. Funnily enough, again, the tendency might be to think that these are all sort of alt-right, basement-dwelling white people. They're not necessarily. This group actually over-indexes on being ethnically diverse because lots of people from ethnically diverse backgrounds come from pretty traditional religious cultures, and therefore we see that over-index, right? So it's important to say as well, right, that not all young men are illiberal, right? Most young men are liberal still, right? This chart has been deeply misrepresented very often. It shows the political ideology based on voting intention of 18 to 29-year-olds, and what you're seeing is both men and women getting more liberal since 2010. But there is a significant cohort of young men who are pulling the average down, somewhere between 20 and 30%, depending on the issue that you ask them about. I'm going to skip over that. That should have been hidden. But there is this agreement amongst the boys that can be boys, boys can't be boys, that men are being discriminated against. Okay, so this is where you start to see that 47% agree that Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson have a point when they say masculinity is under attack. One in 4 young women agree with that, right? So these are some quite stark numbers, but this is where the qual and the ethnography are really important, because behind those numbers, you've actually got quite a range of responses to those statements, right? Some are the Jamies from adolescence. Some do feel, not everybody who feels threatened will actually act on their feelings of threat. Some are just concerned, some are apathetic, some are ambivalent. And amongst that group, if you may have noticed that 27% of women agree that, masculinity is under attack. There's no value judgment in this statement. Some people believe that it is necessary for masculinity to be under attack to undo the years of misogyny and patriarchy that have been in that have afflicted young women. Okay, so there's a range of views, and we have to be very, very careful when we're interpreting these data. This is the group that Gen Z is quite often characterized as. It makes up about, about 1 in 7 or 8 young people who are kind of see the world through the lens of social justice. Importantly, they're happy with their own lives, but they're sort of there out to, as Malika puts it here, save all the people living in the UK. Right, so they're really passionate. Not all of these are activists by any stretch of the imagination. Not everybody does something off the back of being in this group, but this group sees the world through a kind of, if you want, a progressive lens, even though they quite often are quite illiberal as well in taking on other points of view. This was a lovely group to meet, girl power, empowered, optimistic young women. The only problem was we didn't find a group of men who could coalesce in the same way around a positive gender-based identity, right? So if the gender-based identity for men was sort of defensive and we're under attack, these young ladies and young women are not feminists in the classic sense. They are reaping the rewards of feminism. They're just very, very confident. We call them the Spice Girls' daughters. They're succeeding at work. They're succeeding in education. The world is their oyster. And it's a really, really positive sign, and one that we need to work towards to get to get the same kind of flexible, empowering, pluralistic articulation of gender for young men, for their own sake, and also for the sake of women who are quite often the victims of these young men when they get frustrated. And then we've got the dice are loaded. The final segment I'm going to just illustrate very quickly. These guys are pretty peed off. They feel that the system is rigged against them. They have a very rational view of social mobility, of their prospects, and of the inherent unfairness, really, in the socioeconomic system that's biased against young people. We found this group amongst the older generation as well. But what made this group for the younger people different? In the older generation, it was overwhelmingly over-indexing to lower socioeconomic group, as you might expect, and also and as a, sort of as an overlap, but also to people who are living with a disability. In the young person's group, this group is pretty much representative of the population profile, right? It's not poorer, it's not more disabled, right? It is just a group of young people, some of whom you would think, looking at their demographic characteristics, should be pretty happy based on what you'd expect their prospects to be, but they're not, because they don't think that the politicians listen to them. They don't think that the system works for them. So yeah, this group is again another worry. We were asked, which of the groups are you most worried about in terms of being radicalized or being, sort of being fair game for Andrew Tate, and we thought it might be the boys can't be boys, but I think it's this group that is that is the worry, because there is a sort of a dissatisfaction, and amongst some bordering on a rage with the system that makes them quite susceptible to outlets for those feelings. So, 5 minutes left. Let's talk about youth culture. What can we learn about youth culture and their media habits? Right. So, I mentioned before that these guys seamlessly meld in real life experiences and online experiences. But really, as far as we can, if we can talk about a youth culture, which is very, very difficult given the fragmentation, right? It is digital culture, and it's kind of conditioned by these macro factors. But ultimately, there are two that are really important. I've talked about delayed adulthood, okay, which this sort of mix of loss of independence, being cash poor but time rich, but also having life with fewer familial responsibilities and sometimes fewer responsibilities full stop, which gives them the space to socialize, experiment, and pursue passions much later than previous generations could, sometimes even into their early 30s. And the other really important trend is media fragmentation. All right. And the reason that's important is because when we came back to analyze almost everything, the worldviews, where they get their news from, what they do for fun, what they've got in their wardrobe, right? It all just looked like a Spotify playlist. There was no coherence to it, like an album used to be when we were growing up. I could be this today and that tomorrow and another thing today, the day after. And there's just very fluid identities, very fluid worldviews, very fluid interest, and what we called collages, not coherent wholes, but people mixing and picking and choosing in this sort of constantly shifting kaleidoscope of individual pieces, which allows them to form their identities in ways that are far less fixed than was once the case. So previously, main unit, if you want, of youth culture would have been tribes. We probably all remember these. If we were, depending on when you grew up, it might have been mods, it might have been rockers, it might have been punks, it might have been hip hop heads, it might have been garage heads, it might have been whatever, whatever you grew up with. Now, clearly there are still subcultures. So Lauren here, who's a massive esports fan, like has got a career in esports, we do come across them, but the prevailing the prevailing now phenomenon in youth culture is of a cross-cultural kaleidoscope. So here's Katie. We've shown her back because she's taking a photo. But like in this one experience that we had with her, these different worlds of fitness and well-being and coffee and fashion and entrepreneurship, all came together, mediated by Instagram and LinkedIn, into what was a run club, but a run club set up to ultimately help her sell the sustainable coffee cups, which is her business. And then it was just a fascinating in real life experience that really showed how cross-cultural youth culture is. Right. So to wrap up, and I realise this is a whistle-stop tour through a lot, but it's impossible to wrap these guys up neatly in a bow. We can look for tendencies, we can look for trends, we can look for different clusters and different groups within this within this age cohort, but ultimately we can't neatly wrap them up in a bow. They mix digital and real life. They're futuristic, they're nostalgic, they're global, they're local, they value the material, they value the experiential, and so on and so on and so on. So my one plea to everybody here, well, a couple of pleas. Please do not get your Gen Z insight from the newspapers. They are not telling you the truth or the whole story. I think probably they're incapable of doing so. If you see a headline or any kind of research that says Gen Z are, take it with a pinch of salt and look under the bonnet. Look for nuance. Look for use your critical faculties, and remember they're probably not that different from you when you were young. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Konrad. That was just fascinating. I don't know if anyone if you've got time for any questions, if there are any.
I do. Let me just stop sharing.
Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Konrad?
I think there was something in the chat. Oh, it's just people being.
Sorry, I haven't looked at the chat. Michael's got his hand up. Michael?
Yes, I mean, well, just to say, I thought that was absolutely excellent, really fascinating, and really spot on. Some of the things that I just noted down, because I've done quite a bit of work with young people myself. The whole thing, woke is not political. That to many young people who, for example, have a couple of gay friends in their friendship group, but who are largely straight, that is not being political. That is just being nice, just being human. It's just
just being. It's just being.
Why wouldn't you? The second thing is that social media is socializing. I've done quite a lot of work in sport, and people will say to you, young people will say, I watched the Grand Prix, or I watched whatever it may be with my friends. oh, so did they come to you? Did you go to them? No, we were all at our homes, but we were watching and constantly interacting. That is watching with them. And the other thing, just to mention, I think where people go wrong in terms of trying to create materials for young people is the mistake is to dumb down. The mistake is to think that because there is low concentration span and everything needs to be fast moving, that these people are stupid. These people are not stupid. These people are really smart. They need lots of information packaged in a creative and interesting way, not to be treated like they're idiots, which is the way that I think some people go wrong in producing materials for young people. Anyway, just a few thoughts that might add. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I endorse those fully. The attention span is one that gets my goat because I mean, again, this is just about using your critical faculties. Do we really think that the smartphone has rewired our evolutionary biology that to the to the extent that you know that we'd have? They're willing to give you less attention. That's different to having a shorter attention span, but they can sit and watch a live stream for 3 hours.
Yes.
And that's I couldn't do that. We have to be really, really careful with attention span. I think they've got more choice, so they're harsher judges, and that's on you to create better content and better experiences to keep their attention. And if you do so, then they will stay with you.
Exactly.
That's great. Thank you very much, Konrad. A lot of people are going now, so I think, oh, hang on. Rob says, do you see any parallels between the disenfranchised Gen Z groups and the political, oh, sorry, it's disappeared off my screen. Hang on. Oh gosh, and the political shifts we saw again at last week's elections, particularly among older age groups. Are cross-age group comparisons useful for understanding the broader factors at play and the implications?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing to say, do we see any parallels? Yes. And a lot of, I mean, as I mentioned, Dictatorgate, and that's that we stand by. But I think there, a lot of what young people are doing politically is a cry for help because the system isn't working for them, and so they can tend to gravitate towards just protest votes essentially to make their to make their points because they don't feel listened to. And if you look at the policy agenda, it's fair enough for them to think that that they're not being listened to. On cross-generational and cross-age, yes, absolutely. This is not an age thing. This is a disenfranchisement thing, and there are plenty of old people who are disenfranchised too. As we made the point at the very beginning, age is not the only fruit at all, and you need to look at everything in the round to understand when age is and isn't important. And I think in politics it can be, but there are large swathes of the population. You might have seen in our 9 segments that when I harshly got rid of the older people very quickly, there was a group there called the Left Behind who were essentially analogous to the Dice Loaded group in Gen Z. So yes, you could treat those as one cross-generational group.
That's great. We're losing quite a few people now, so I think we'll leave it there. But thank you so much. It's been fascinating. And of course, this will be available on the website in due course. So thank you, Konrad, for giving up your time, and thank you to everybody else for attending.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.